Probably just wait a couple more minutes here. And hopefully people start trickling in.
Yeah, that's fine.
I wonder while we're waiting, since I don't know most of the people who are going to be here, if you want to tell us what I'm curious to know what your disciplines are. If you want to tell us or put it in the chat.
Anybody wants to start first? Go ahead.
I'll go first. I am in kinesiology and integrative physiology department, and I'm mostly focused on how the brain regulates the cardiovascular system.
Good. What about the rest of you? Or you can add it to the chat if you don't want to speak.
Let's see. Betsy says she's in applied cognitive science and human factors, looking into sense making and motivated reasoning in questioning our initial ideas about a situation. Thank you, Betsy. Chrono is from biological sciences and cancer research.
Melanie, we're asking the participants.
Oh, I'm civil environmental engineering, water resources, some data science.
Awesome. Marina just joined us. Marina, would you like to share what your discipline is before we get started to get a good feel for the room?
Yeah, I'm in the library, so I'm not, I'll use the chat, I think, but
Yeah.
I'm in the Humanities department, and I'm in communication and cultural studies.
Vina
All right.
or Santi, do you want to share quick?
Oh, yeah.
We were just asking people what discipline they were in and what they're studying.
Hi, I'm Vina. I'm also from the Humanities department, and I'm in rhetoric and communication, technical communication.
Great, welcome.
All right. So it's 4:35, 4:36. We can go ahead and get started. Pretty sure people are just going to start trickling in later. So welcome everybody to our Journal Writing and Publication Workshop, brought to you by the GSG. If you ever need our previous resources, we have access to our website where we have all of our old videos. If you're interested in seeing a range of topics that we discuss, please go ahead and visit our website. We have a range of stuff there. And also we always, appreciate your feedback and suggestions and topics that you'd like to see that we can bring to you. please feel free to reach out, and that's my email address right there. So yeah, if you have any good ideas, let us know. All right, so just a couple of things coming up. We have our next seminar, which will be public speaking and communications, hosted by Marina and Vina. It's going to be on the 27th of October at 4:30 to 6:30 at the MEME 111. So, feel free to tell your friends and come on down. And we also have Mike Kalasa, who is an adjunct professor for the College of Business here at Michigan Tech, but he's also a certified, financial planner, and he'll be talking to graduate students about how to manage your finances when you're in college. I'm pretty sure a lot of us would, appreciate a couple of tricks to help us out. So if you have time, please feel free to swing by on the 11th of November, 4:30 to 6:30. We will have, food and stuff at the event, so please tell your friends and come on down. All right, so we'll get to this a little later. We'll have our Vice President Ronit, who will drop by just to kind of talk to us about some of the new tools that we're going to be having for students at Michigan Tech. We're going to be using Grammarly. We're going to have the premium access to it. I think it'll be really handy. So we'll have Ronit come in and talk to us a little bit here. All right, so as usual, as much of us are all pretty suited with Zoom now, we know how to use the chat feature. So if you have any questions that you don't want to, ask or during the midway, just feel free to put it in the chat and we'll get to your questions. And there'll also be time at the end for questions too. All right, with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Shari and Dr. Romney, who are our speakers for today. Dr. Shari is a returning speaker from last year, and we're glad to have Dr. Abram here today. So.
Sure, thank you. I'll just go ahead and get started. So just to set you up a little bit for the format, we're going to talk about really 5 different aspects of writing today, submitting papers to journals. We're going to each share our perspectives about them. My perspective is from more social science research. I work in math education. Do a lot of qualitative work. So I will be sharing that perspective. And I don't know, do you want to say, Dr. Romney, what your perspective is?
Yeah, I'm in rhetoric and composition. And so in the humanities fields here, but specifically in the rhetoric side of that.
Yeah.
And
So
I'm an associate professor here. I actually used to direct the Writing Center. So we worked quite a bit with graduate students working on this kind of thing in that context too. Awesome.
So we're going to just each take our turn talking about each of these topics. It's going to be more of just a discussion. We don't have a lot of slides for you or anything, but I'm going to just invite you, if you have questions as we go, we're going to stop at the end of each topic and pause for you to ask questions. But if you have pressing questions as we go, I'm perfectly fine with you jumping in and asking them too. And you can either use the chat, or if you want to just turn on your microphone, that's good too. So the first thing we're going to talk about is choosing a journal. And I think there's a number of different factors for me that go into choosing a journal. One of them, of course, is the journal ranking, or in a lot of fields, they talk about different tiers of journals. And, if a study that I've done is I hope all of my studies are solid, but some studies end up being bigger and better than other studies. I always try to go for the highest tier journal that I can go for. Unfortunately, in my field, the very top tier is like only 3 to 5 journals, so you can't always publish in those journals. But I try to think about, is this a top tier journal paper? Does it fit into that sort of a journal? So if it does, that's certainly what I work towards, is getting them in one of those top tier journals. Sometimes the papers need to go in like a medium tier journal or a lower tier journal, and depending on what the paper is about. I think it's important always, as a starting point, to look at the aims and scope of the journal. If you go to a publisher's or a journal website, there's always a section on it that talks about the scope of the journal. So that generally says, here's what this journal publishes. If you don't find a good fit for your paper, you can get a desk reject. In other words, the editor just doesn't even send it out for review. They'll just send it back to you and say, no, this doesn't fit our journal. So, understanding the aims and scope of the journal is really important because you don't want to waste time waiting for a desk reject. Another thing that I often do is I look at some recent publications in the journal and try to get an overview of what's been published recently. Sometimes the focus of a journal changes slightly based on the current editor because editorships turn over. So if you can get a sense of what they've been publishing recently, sometimes you can see if you're sort of in the ballpark of what that journal is looking for at any given time. You can kind of see if it's a good fit. That sort of works with the aim and scope of the journal. And a couple other things that I take into consideration, I try to plan for multiple manuscripts over time. So if I know I'm doing a study and I'm going to maybe get 2 or 3 papers out of it, I try to think about those 3 papers or 2 papers as a collection, because one journal is probably not going to take all of those papers. So I need to think about, if I'm going to write a couple of papers or 3 papers, I need to think about where they all fit at the same time so that I can kind of have a bigger picture plan for where I'm going to put my work. And sometimes, quite honestly, sometimes my decision comes down to something as simple as the length of a manuscript. Some journals, the manuscripts are very short, like 5,000 words. And if I have a complicated study, it often doesn't fit in those kind of papers. And some of them have like 10 or 12,000 words, and that works out better. So sometimes I exclude a journal just because it's not going to work for the kind of paper that I write. So that particular paper. So those are some of the things that I think about, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Romney.
Yeah, I think those are great observations. And my, field is a little bit different. One of the first things that I put down was, it was similar. Reputation / rank is one of the things you might think about. However, in the humanities, we don't tend to have as standardized way of looking at rank. And it often depends on what it is in terms of the scope of what they publish. If you have a good fit that really fits what the journal does, that can kind of trump whether or not it's considered the flagship in your field or not, because people looking for that kind of topic might see it. On the other hand, if you publish in a niche journal, then maybe it doesn't get read as widely in your field. So that's kind of the way that I think about rank sometimes. And there are, what are considered kind of flagship journals in rhetoric and composition, for example, and you want to figure out what those are in your field. You want to figure out if there's a ranking system that works well. Our impact factors and things like that don't really work often the same in our fields, just because of the number of citations. The way we do citation is sometimes different too. It's but the other thing that I was thinking about in terms of choosing a journal to help you find a place, really fit is important. And that what you said about a desk reject is definitely important to keep in mind. You want to make sure that if you're submitting to a journal, especially just sending in a submission cold, you want to make sure that you've done your research on the journal that you've decided on. So there are some other factors to keep in mind, like how selective the journal is, and the time to publication depends on what kind of timeline you're on. So you can find some of these things out. I would talk to people you trust in your field, your advisor, find out, what is the reputation of this journal before you take the time to submit to it. And the types of articles they publish, you want to make sure that matches what you do. And you can look on the journal websites, and you can get a sense there of whether or not you're a match. So that's where I would start, is maybe look at journal websites and get a sense. And then when you find one that you think when you find 1 or 2 or 3 that you think you match well with, then I would take some time reading in those journals. When you're kind of once you're established in the field, you have a sense of what are the flagship journals, what are the reputations, and you also hopefully subscribe to some of those, so you are always kind of up on the conversation to some extent. But when you're coming at it from the graduate student perspective, it can be a little bit daunting because there's a kind of conversation that's ongoing in these journals in terms of what they consider current research and then what has been done on those topics. So if you can go back a few issues of the journal, look at abstracts, read some of the articles, and get a sense of if your work fits in there, and that can help you later as you're preparing the manuscript to know if you're citing the right kinds of research as well. And some things to consider also are whether or not they're open access. And I know that in the sciences, if the journals that comply with the funding requirements for publication are also important. And the other thing is permissions. Some journals will allow you to, take the final version of if it's not open access, some journals will still allow you to share on your own university repository of articles, what kind of, so you can share it pretty widely, or you can share it on your own website or something like that. You might want to find those things out about the journal previously if you want to be able to share it more widely, or just the circulation that journal already has, to make sure you get your new and exciting information to the audience that you want to earn through your work, basically.
Mhm. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions at this point about choosing a journal? One thing that your comments brought up for me, some of the journals, especially the open access ones, do have a publication cost with them. So you want to, know what that is, because you might need funding to actually publish in a particular journal. One thing I'd be careful about, though, is that there's a lot of predatory journals out there that are not peer reviewed and are not thought of very highly. And basically, if they promise like quick turnaround or things like that, or you really need to be careful. You don't want to get your work into, predatory journals, or, you want to really get them into journals that are accepted, in academia as good journals.
Yeah, and that can be kind of tough to know, that because I know at one point there was kind of a list that had been kept of what are the predatory journals out there, but I think that isn't very current necessarily, and it kind of keeps evolving. But right, if they're asking you to pay, that usually can be a sign, although there is, as you mentioned, some journals have a fee that you can pay for open access. Right. Meaning that you pay the fee so that then it can be open and nobody has to have the article behind a paywall.
Right. A pay for open access, though, is very different than a pay for just publishing. That should raise some red flags for you.
I did mention calls for papers. So special issues, that can be something. Sometimes a special issue it depends on how people view it, but I view them pretty positively, because they often focus a journal issue on a particular topic. And if it so happens that topic is what you're researching, that can be a great place to get your self-published, and also increase your chances of publication, because you're already, not only are you choosing a place that fits what you're doing, but they're actually actively asking for the kind of research you're doing. So I think it can kind of be a good place to be aware of if you have something already that you're working on that matches. So you can look at various publishers. I know Taylor and Francis has this, where you can search through calls for papers that come from special issues, and it's worth taking a look to see if something you're working on matches a special issue that is coming out. Mm-hmm. In the humanities, I would also say that there still is a tendency to have edited collections, and that's a little bit not the same as a journal article, but it's basically a journal article published in an edited book. And sometimes those are viewed, there's really kind of a mixed reaction to those. Sometimes they can be really great and a really timely publication that has a good reputation, and other times they're not usually as prestigious. And in my experience, edited collections sometimes take more work to publish in than a journal. For some reason, there seems to be a lot more kind of back and forth and editing, I think partly because they're trying to shape it for what the editor wants the book to look like. Mm-hmm.
No questions? Either we were really good or they don't know what to ask.
If you have any questions along the way, feel free to type them in the chat or raise your hands.
Yeah. Otherwise, we want to move on to a writing plan.
All right, let's do. So developing a writing plan, this really, thinking about this and thinking of all your disciplines when I was thinking of what to suggest on developing a writing plan, made me really kind of think about the difference between what is research and what you would publish in an article. Often I hear students in the science, grad students, or even, talk about when you are doing your research and you just need to write it up, right? This idea that the data's there and I've done the research and now I just need to write it up. That's not usually how we think about it in the humanities. It's more about making arguments, and it depends on the kind of thing you're doing. But that's, in terms of a writing plan, the first step is to determine if you have the data you need to write and the information and the research done. And so if you do that, in my case, we end up reading a lot, often in maybe historical research or in just reading in the field. And as you read, it's been helpful to me to think about the idea of taking notes that can be useful to me later. So not just taking random notes, but being careful in taking your notes and making sure that anything that is a quotation is quoted. Just kind of basic things, but have them get that to where you have quotations and citations that are ready to go, so that when it comes time to write, you're not going back to the research process. So my suggestion is to kind of think about the process separately. And I'm talking to myself too, because sometimes I combine all these steps together, and it's more helpful if you think about, the writing, the editing, and also the research in kind of separate process, but that's iterative, that you kind of go through this loop of writing and then taking a break and then working on editing and then doing some writing. So the most important thing in that regard, though, is to try to be consistent. So people recommend having a regular time where you write each day, and that can work for some. Some people might work in kind of bursts of long periods of writing. Don't overestimate your ability to do that effectively, because I think you lose some effectiveness after a while. And if you start pacing yourself a bit, you'll find that your writing will improve, and you'll change the way that you look at writing. And that's kind of speaking from my own experience, going from often writing things with a deadline and writing large quantities at once. I realized that when you write for publication, you have to take it a lot slower and really do the editing and revisions along the way. And so separate those tasks out, the writing, the editing, and the research, but have them effectively work together. And then if you can, make writing social. A writing group or a partner can be helpful, committing to a weekly meeting or taking turns looking at each other's material. I think the most effective scholars are the ones who do find a way to make their writing social. And it can be painful to have other people read your writing, but the more you do that, the more you're ready to then send it to a journal, and you'll have more confidence in doing that. So those are my suggestions on developing a writing plan.
Yeah, and I would agree, having a regular time for writing, I think, is important. And different things work for different people. So you will hear the people that say, oh, you have to write every day. You have to make an hour for writing every day. I'm just going to say flat out, that has never worked for me. I can't do it, because I find that I need a block of time for writing. So, I'm better off if I can set aside a half a day to write, for example, because then I can get into the work and I kind of get into a flow after a while and can really make some headway. So I've never been an everyday writer. So don't feel like just because that's sort of the thing that's out there, that everyone says that, but that doesn't work for everyone. So find what works for you. The other thing I find is when I am writing and I get stuck on one part of the manuscript, don't just keep beating your head into the wall, do something else. For example, sometime if I'm really stuck, I'll do something like work on the reference list, Because even though it's sort of a menial part of the task, it's something that I know I can always make progress on. Some parts are easier for me than others. The methodology is usually easy, so I work on that when I'm feeling like I don't have a lot of brain power. The lit review is probably one of the more challenging pieces of the manuscript for me, or the theoretical framework of the manuscript. So, those involve more effort. So I kind of switch between the pieces. I don't write a paper linearly. I don't think I've ever written a paper linearly from beginning to end, because a research paper has different sections. And I think that's one of the nice pieces of it, is you can work on, the pieces that you're ready to work on at any given time. As a matter of fact, you can even start working on some of the pieces while you're collecting data. And a lot of you, I think, will probably do this as you're writing your thesis or dissertation. You can start working on, the literature review or the methodology even before you have all of the data. So you can sort of switch up your work time into some writing and some data analysis, some maybe even data collection, and kind of do different things so you don't get so stuck in one thing. One of the best pieces of advice that I was given early in my career is to think about your overall writing flow over time. And I was told to think about always having pieces at different points in the pipeline. So always having something under review. So it's out there being reviewed, you're just sitting on it, you can't do anything about it. Having something that you're actively working on, and then knowing what your next project's going to be. So it's sort of like, that one's off the plate, this one's on the plate, this one's going to be coming on next. And if I can sort of think about keeping things in those different phases, that for me has really provided me with a continuous stream of publications over quite a long period of time now. It doesn't always work out that nicely. It's nice in theory, but sometimes you're working on something and that paper that was under review suddenly comes back with revisions. That disrupts your flow. You get hung up on a paper longer than you think you're going to. But if you can just generally think about that in theory, it provides a really nice pipeline for your work, I think. I mean, that's something that's really helped me over time to, kind of keep getting pubs out. In my field, and I don't know if this is true in all fields, but in my field, a lot of times people write conference papers first and then turn them into big manuscripts. The advantage of this for me is a conference paper is short. They're 4 to 8 pages, depending on the conference. It feels like a more doable task. And it allows me to get the ideas out there. I can present it at the conference. I can talk to people about it. And then I can figure out what's working or not working before I turn it into a full manuscript. So the conference paper is like a short version of what's later going to be a big journal article. That's really helped me over time, because sometimes it's like, I'm not quite sure how to write about this or how to frame it, and I can just get it out there quicker. Plus the turnaround time is faster on a conference paper. So that's sort of nice to get in the pipeline. And I think that's about all that I was going to share there. Are there questions or comments about that? You guys are you shy, or are you?
I think I just want to add on that writing every day. That's true. That's something that you read, that writing every day is kind of the way to do it, and that's something that can make you feel guilty all the time, right? Because it's hard sometimes to find that time. On the other hand, I would just say write as frequently as you can, and in doing that, try to make even if you don't have as much time, don't let that be an excuse to keep you from working on it. Say, oh, I'm waiting for when I have 3 hours to work on this. I'll do it later. Yeah. So if you can kind of somewhere in between there, it's a good way to balance.
I'll just say, though, the way I make time for that, I actually schedule it on my calendar. I put it on my calendar as a meeting with myself, so no one else bugs me, no one else requests meetings. It's just on my calendar. And I found that has been really productive for all of my research time. It's like scheduling time that you're going to work in the lab, or time you're going to prep for your class or anything else. I schedule time for writing. And then I don't have to try to find the 3 hours because it's already there. Unless someone begs really hard and interrupts my time, but generally it's there.
I have a question.
Sure.
How do you overcome writer's block? So I set aside time as frequently as I can to write, and then I will just stare at my screen. And it's not that I don't know what I want to write, it's just I don't know how to eloquently put what I'm thinking into text.
Okay, so there's your problem. You don't need to be eloquent on the first draft.
That's true. Yes, okay, that's fair.
Well, yeah, but I think that's where people get hung up, is they're trying to make it perfect the first time. You know, I always tell my grad students, get something on paper, commit to writing a page. And even though it might be a messy page, it might be drafty ideas, that's okay. At least you have something down. I think if you get stuck trying to make it perfect right away, you're not going to make progress.
Yeah, that's actually what I was trying to get at with separating the different parts of the process. So don't think about editing while you write. And I'm telling myself that because I definitely want it to sound great as it's coming out. And if I get hung up on that, I write a lot less. So write and then go back, and you'll find that you at least have something that helps you get over that writer's block, because you put something out on the page, and now you'll have ideas about what you wrote. And that actually helps kind of dispel some of the myths about writing that are pretty long held in our culture, that, you know, writing is just taking what's in your brain and putting it on the page, which all the research on it shows that that's not really what happens. It's more of a process. So get it out there. I used to kind of have this fantasy when I was in graduate school that they would come up with a natural language processing, you know, software that would allow me to just keep talking about what I was thinking about, and then the computer would tell me what my ideas were. And it would organize them for me and cut out all the extra stuff. But because that can be kind of a frustrating thing. You know, a lot of things are going around in your head, but once you get them out there, you can kind of come back and be that editor later and help see what it was you were trying to get at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I also, this also relates to my comment about work on the parts. Don't get stuck on one part. You know, I don't know I can't remember what field you're in, Jessica, but, you know, in my, you know, there's different sections to a paper. So if I'm stuck on a hard section, I'll just go work on something else. Like I said, that's why sometimes I'll even just work on references just because they're easy, you know, or work on like the methodology, or I'll make a table or a figure. If I know I need a table or a figure for the paper, I'll just spend some time doing that. So sometimes I work on hard things if I get in a good flow, and sometimes I just work on easy things.
All right, thank you guys so much. I've been just having the most severe writer's block lately, and I even tried that method. I was like, oh, I'll just write the methods. And then I got done with the methods and I was like, okay, now what? So yeah, thank you for your advice.
Yeah, don't get hung up, just get something down. Any other questions before we move on?
I guess I do have one more question. I don't know if it necessarily pertains to like preparing. Well, yeah, it does. So like while we're reading, so like as scientists or any other type of researchers, individual, we read a lot. We read a lot of other journal articles, a lot of textbooks, etc. Go to conferences. How do you just keep track of all that information that is like in your brain that you know, and where it came from? So I use OneNote as like an organization tool, and I have found that does help me quite a bit of keeping just like, these are all my journals related to these niche topics, and then I can make notes on them. But then it's just kind of tedious as you're writing to go back and be like, all right, I learned this tiny little piece of information from this specific journal. And that, you know, like, how do you keep track of all that knowledge that you know as you're letting the words kind of flow out?
I don't worry, Jessica, about all the citations and stuff when I'm first letting the words fly out from you to come out. I mean, if I know the citation, as you get further into your field, you will know the literature better. especially the area, where you specialize, you kind of know the literature and know where things came from. But if I don't know the reference right away, I don't get hung up on that. I just put parenthesis afterwards and write reference. And then I'll go back and look at that, which is also a great thing to do when you're stuck some other time. Go back and find the reference. But using some sort of a organizer like EndNote or something like that certainly helps. If you can, and this is me too, with saying this to myself, because I'm not always good at putting things in EndNote, and I should be better at it. Taking things with keywords or things like that. Yeah, you do need to have some sort of an organization system, but it does get better over time. It's easier as you get further into the field.
Yeah, I'll say though, I don't feel bad if you feel like you're not organized. I mean, I use OneNote sometimes, and I use Zotero, and I've tried different ways of taking notes, and sometimes it's just in a document and I'm taking notes. But I think the most important thing is to try to take some notes when you read. I remember reading something about a book about dissertations, and the author said, if you're just reading and not taking notes, you may as well be reading a novel. This idea that you might as well just be reading for pleasure. And it is true that you won't remember, you will forget a lot. And so that's one of the kind of painful things about graduate studies. You read so many things that it can feel kind of overwhelming. So do take notes when you know that it's important, but try to do it in a process where when you read something, you read it intentionally and take the notes and then try to finalize some of those notes so that when you go to write, you'll have them. On the other hand, if you're writing and you know there's a reference, I'll do that same thing that you're mentioning, Shari, where I know I need to put a note. I'll just make a note to myself and I'll say, reference needed, or that one article by so-and-so that I'm pretty sure it's in there, and then later you can double check. But it is kind of a messy process, and the more you can come up with a system that works for you, it's a little bit of trial and error. But using something like OneNote is a good start. It's something you can search through, and you can kind of create a pattern for yourself for taking those notes.
Yeah. The other thing I do is just organize the articles themselves. I have folders that this is a bunch of articles relates to this topic. These articles relate to this topic. So if I need to go back and find a reference for something particular, at least it's in the right folder.
That's a good point. I use Zotero that way. I'll create a folder on the topic I'm researching, and then I can, just use the browser plugin to save articles in that folder, and then I can go back to them.
All right, I have a follow-up question if that's okay. I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
So going back to note taking, so do you take notes while you're reading, or do you wait until you're finished? Just from a professional standpoint, you guys, what you've both found most helpful, do you read through an article completely and then kind of synopsisize it at the end, or do you read and then as you're reading you're like, oh, that's interesting, I'll highlight it, or oh, that's interesting, I'll write down a question next to that statement, oh, this is contradictory to this article that I found, or something like that? Or, so do you wait until the end of the article, or do you take notes as you kind of read?
Yes, both.
Okay.
Yeah.
Same.
I usually still highlight. I mean, when I started doing my research, we were more like print it out and highlight, and that's, I mean, I'm pretty dated, so I still like the highlighter, and I still sometimes even like reading on paper. I try to use more electronics now. But I kind of highlight when I'm reading, and especially quotes, things I might want to actually grab later but then I do try to summarize then at the end to kind of get the big picture. And in my big picture, I try to think about how might I use this later in my work. So I don't just summarize what they did, but I try to think about it in the context of my own work.
Yeah, for a while I was using Zotero to do this, because I could highlight text, and then there was a plugin that would then make it so that Zotero would pull all the things that I'd highlighted out and put them as quotes, and then I could take notes around there. I think you kind of want to do both. And once you've done your notes, then if you can connect that up by taking some time to look over your notes and then condense that down to the things that you might actually want to cite or say in an article, then you're already doing some of the writing and you're making those notes useful. And so then you can keep those separately for when you write. You're not looking at all your highlights again and trying to find where was that thing that I thought was interesting. You've already done that work and you have something that you're ready to work with as you write.
I also find it better if you can, when you're highlighting, don't over highlight, because that is not useful. If half the article's highlighted, then it's pointless. I think I've become more selective about what I highlight now than maybe what I used to, do when I first started out. All right, I'm going to transition to preparing a manuscript. So, of course, preparing a manuscript is part of the writing process, but just specifically thinking about getting a paper ready for a journal. A couple of things. One thing that, and this kind of goes back to the writing process, but one thing that I have found in my area where if you have especially a word limit, is I try to rough out some sort of a plan before I start. Like if I know I only have 8,000 words and I need to, write my manuscript in that space and I have all these things I need to say, I try to develop some kind of a rough outline to begin with, to think about roughly how much space I can dedicate to each piece. And that's just so I don't end up overwriting. I mean, there's nothing worse than if you can only have 20 pages and you end up with 30. And I know as a grad student, that probably seems impossible because how could you ever write too much? But it does happen when you're trying to elaborate on your studies. So that's one thing that I think I find helpful. But in general, you really need to know what the journal guidelines are when you are preparing your manuscript, because every journal's different. Everyone has different formatting, everyone has different referencing guidelines. So it's really important. On every journal website, there's guidelines for authors. They tell you exactly what your paper needs to look like when you submit it. You really need to spend some time there and think about that. And I wouldn't do that while you're writing. That's not, Jessica, something to get bogged down on. Just get it out there. That's part of the editing process later on, is to think about, do my figures and tables need to be embedded in the text? Or do they need to go in separate documents? Do I need special margins? Do I need page numbers? Do I need all of those sorts of things? So just look at what the journal website asks you to do and make sure that you are, that you're following those closely. Because again, that could lead to a desk reject if you don't follow the guidelines. Also things like, what does the abstract need to look like? Do you need in-text references? Different things like that. So just be really careful about that. One of the things that I always do before submitting is I try to find a friendly reviewer. Well, maybe not friendly, a critical friend, I guess. I usually have my papers reviewed by someone else before I submit them. Because even though sometimes you don't want to hear the feedback, it's certainly better to hear it before you get rejected by an editor. So sometimes I think it's all ready to go and I send it out to someone and they're like, yeah, this part doesn't make any sense, or this ordering doesn't really work. And it's frustrating because it could delay your submission by some amount of time, but also it makes it a better paper in the long run. So I think sometimes you just have to have some patience as you're thinking about, getting your manuscript prepared and, and spend the time to do it well, because the better manuscript you can submit, the better your likelihood of getting it accepted into the journal that you want to put it into. Yeah, I think that's my big picture there. Abraham, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, we've divided this up. So
I know
you make
it's a little bit awkward.
Well, I mean, make the writing plan and then you prepare the manuscript. I mean, you're kind of doing these things together.
Yeah.
Right. You've decided what journal you kind of have a system that you start to use for it, and then prepare your manuscript. So I think one of the things that I wrote down is just make it as good as you can. And sometimes having someone else read that as part of that process. Sometimes it might be just giving yourself time and going over it again. And I remember the first article that I got published in kind of a flagship journal in my field. I remember submitting it and telling my wife, if they don't accept this, then maybe I'm not cut out for this because this was as good as I could make it. You know, this was, I really had gone over it a lot and made sure it was as good as I could. And then of course there was feedback. It ended up getting accepted, but it's this kind of amazing process where you get the editor's comments and they find insights and things that you hadn't thought of, and you can still make it even better. So that can be exciting. It can also be kind of discouraging and can take kind of a long time, but you can make it quicker by making sure that you don't have errors. So not only, you avoid the desk reject, but you also make it so that it's more pleasant for them to work with, and ultimately they're not making editorial comments on things that you could have fixed. They're giving you ideas, and the reviewers are giving you ideas and things that you can change to make it better. The other thing I wrote down was to make sure you clearly convey the importance of the study and show how it adds to an active research area. Because I think that's something that can kind of be lost in the shuffle a little bit. I heard a scholar talking recently about the red flags that journal editors and reviewers will make them kind of reject something. And he said he had 3 overs. You can over anchor was what he said. So if you go back too far in the kind of research on your field and it feels like a grad student paper, like a dissertation or something, if you've gone too far, it shows that you didn't kind of narrow down to what the area of research that you're doing is. And then the other thing he said was overlooking. So if you overlook recent articles in your area, that can kind of make it so that you don't show how important your research is to current conversations. And then the other one was kind of overstating the importance of what you're doing too. So you want to be somewhere in the middle there and kind of measured about what you're doing, but be clear to show what is the contribution that you're making that would really, ultimately, you're trying to show that not, when you write for a term paper or you write for some other context, you're maybe showing, I've done the work, I understand all of this background, and I'm proving to my advisor, whoever it is, that I've done this. When you're writing for a journal, you're trying to show that you're making something that can be useful to someone else, and that you're entering a conversation and adding something to that. So there's a little bit different kind of audience there. So that's what I would think about when I'm preparing the manuscript, in addition to the other things that you said about, citation guidelines and some of those things that are, following the journal's guidelines to make sure that you look like, or your work looks like something that belongs in that journal.
Right. I'll just add one of the things that your comments sparked for me. When I'm reviewing papers, one of the things that I always look for, and you'd be surprised how much this is missing, is if there are clear research questions at the beginning, and if those questions actually get answered at the end. And you would be amazed how many times one of those 2 pieces are missing. And if the research questions are clear or unclear, it's hard to know what contribution the work makes. And I know that might be a little bit different in humanities, where you're trying to make a case for something, but if you're really collecting data to answer a question, you better know what your question is, and then you better make sure you answer the question. And I think that's one of my biggest reasons I think that I reject papers when I'm reviewing, is I don't know what the questions is, or the questions are not answered. So I just think having those pieces in there is really important.
Yeah, and I think, in humanities, it really depends. There's some methodologies where you're using data and you're using qualitative or quantitative data even, but often you're making arguments, and did you answer the question you set out to answer is important, and also did you give good reasons for accepting the arguments that you made based on that information. So that's there was one other thing I was thinking of, but it's escaped me. If it comes back to me, I'll say it. But
Sure. Before we move on, are there any other questions about anything that's sparked in the preparing a manuscript section? I know it is very much related to what we were talking about before.
Oh, I just remembered what I was going to say. In the humanities, this can be kind of difficult. In the sciences, often, and in different journals, you'll see the kind of structure of the articles. So like you said earlier, you know that you have the methods section or whatever. This can be kind of difficult in the humanities because the journal articles don't always follow the same format, and it can be a little bit more organic based on the argument that's being made. So that can be kind of difficult in preparing it. But in that case, you can give yourself an outline and headings for what the different sections are doing for you, and that can be a helpful way of kind of structuring your argument. So you end up doing a similar thing, but I always found that a little bit difficult because I didn't know sometimes when I'd start writing something where I was going with it. You don't have that kind of the disciplinary structure in the same way that you do with an IMRAD article.
Yeah. Sometimes I feel like I get lost in the ideas too, and I forget where I'm going. I often find that, especially in the framing on the front end of my paper, like I'll have to stop and step back and say, okay, what am I saying, and what's the flow of ideas here? And and I've actually gone back before, like looked through my whole lit review and said, okay, what's this paragraph about? And what's this paragraph about? And what's this paragraph about? And actually, I just had to step back and like analyze my own work and think about, what am I actually saying? And how do these ideas flow? I've actually gotten desperate enough some time to print it out and cut it up with scissors and organize it. I know you can cut and paste, but sometimes just moving those things around have really helped me see like what the whole was.
Yeah. A really weird thing that I've noticed is that I have to do this process in single spacing. If I have it double spaced, I can't see the scope of it for some reason. So just find your own, what it is that works for you and what is your tick or whatever with this. But for me, it has to be single spaced. And the other thing that I notice as I go through the different steps, I have the kind of generative moment where I'm writing this, and then later I go back, and when I'm getting it ready for publication or for submitting, then as I'm reading, I'm asking myself with every sentence, did I really mean that? And do I really know that? And so sometimes I'm rewriting it as I go at that point and really editing it and saying, is this something that was just sounded good, or does it actually have meaning? And what did I mean? Is there a clearer way to say it? So that's part of the process, is to really get, hopefully, to something that you feel really confident in that you've written.
Mm-hmm. And I would also, I feel like we keep adding, but you're spurring new ideas. I also think early on, I had a hard time throwing writing away. Like just recognizing that chunk does not help and just getting rid of it. Cause I think there's a sense, I wrote that it's important. I need to keep it. Sometimes when I'm writing, I'll move those pieces to the end of the paper, kind of just like in a parking lot. But you really do need to just be able to step back and say, yeah, that piece is not helping. I need to just delete it and let it go. Just because you wrote the words doesn't mean that they're words that need to be kept or, need to be included in the final paper.
Yeah, actually, I have a quote here that I had written down from a book I read recently. It said, "Cutting is the best editorial tool of all," and it can be really tough. I do a similar thing. I create a document that has the same title as the article, and then I call it scraps. And so then I just take it. It ends up being about as long as the article sometimes. Just things that you cut out, but that way I know I'm not throwing it away for good. If I need to pull it back, I can. Right. And I almost never do.
No, I never do either.
Yeah. It's just a little, find the ways to trick yourself into moving on.
All right. Should we move on to submitting?
Yeah, let's do. And this was my section here to start. Okay. Yeah. So make a submission plan, really. This kind of goes back to step one, which is where is it going to go? So you know where it's going to go. You kind of have a plan of what needs to happen along the way. You've done that, hopefully. But have a plan, if it gets rejected, where might you submit it after that? So that can kind of help with the devastation that you can feel as if something doesn't get accepted. And the other part is, and this varies on journals. Some journals will ask for a specific cover letter, some won't, but often that is the case that you can kind of submit it with a little bit of a pitch, as it were, where you talk about, what's the title of the article, what have you done, what are the findings, and then especially why do you think readers of that journal would be interested? So that's pretty brief. That's what I've got on some kind of the submitting stage. If you want to add.
Yeah, few things to add. I mean, one thing, I think the biggest thing that I always forget is how long it takes to submit an article. It is not like something you're going to do quickly before you go to your next class. I actually find that it can take several hours to submit an article. Because as you start getting into the submission process, there's things like they ask for, keywords, or they ask you to enter acknowledgements, or they ask you to, there's just all sorts of different things that happen during the submission process. It actually needs to be something that you spend time on. It's not something that you do quickly just to get out of the way. You have to write a cover letter sometimes. There's different pieces to it. Blinding papers actually takes some time, depending on, I'm into a study now that my colleagues and I have been working on for 10 years. And so now we end up with a lot of self-citations in the article, and that just takes a lot of time to blind and get it really into a format where we can submit. So I think that's one of the things that I always forget. Like when I go to submit, I always think it's going to be faster than it is, and it never gets better. So, just allow yourself a lot of time. Try to think through if you can get into the system and look at some of those pieces that you need ahead of time. That's really helpful. Like, am I going to need a cover letter? Am I going to need a separate abstract? Am I going to need to pick keywords from some lists? Some of the journals actually have lists of keywords that you need to pick from, and some you can pick your own. But to think about what those keywords are, because if people are searching, you want your article to come up, so you need the right keywords, just like funding acknowledgements, all sorts of things like that. So I think that's just pay attention to the details, and all of those pieces really do matter. I'm gonna pause if there's any questions. Otherwise, it looks like some people are needing to leave. So I'll get to the revise and resubmit part. I don't know, Adam or Abraham, maybe you've had this experience, but I have never, ever had a paper that did not have some revisions. And
yeah, I don't think I have either. It's just part of the process.
It's part of the process. I guess that's the biggest thing that I would say is it's part of the process. So, sometimes you'll get the reviewer comments, and sometimes you take them personally and they feel kind of hurtful, and sometimes they're really hard to read, especially if it's a major revision or a rejection. But what I always find is when I first get those, I just read them and then I set them aside and step away from them for a while, because it's really easy to be reactionary to the reviews that you get and kind of feel defensive about them and so forth. But I think the way you frame the revision process is really important. When the process works well, your manuscript is going to be better in the end. And I think if you can frame it that way, that these are people who are trying to help you make your work better, I think that that's really helpful. So I usually put it aside for a little bit and then come back to it and try to reread it when I'm not defensive anymore, and think about what they're really trying to say. And if you have a good editor, and hopefully you do, a good editor should summarize the reviews for you and give you a clear direction on what exactly you need to do in your revision. That doesn't always happen. I find that it happens more in the higher tier journals, and that's probably why they're higher tier journals. That the editor will actually, usually there's 3 or 4 reviews, the editor will synthesize those reviews and tell you to attend to all the reviewer comments, but to particularly pay attention to X, Y, and Z. That's really helpful, because then I know where to focus my work. Every now and then I get a paperback that just says, yeah, do what the reviewers say, which is not always particularly helpful, because sometimes the reviewers say contradictory things. Or, sometimes it seems like the reviewers didn't really, I've had reviewers tell me that things were missing that were clearly in the paper. So you have to be a little bit, careful when you look at those. I would say that remember that you don't need to address every reviewer comment. You don't need to make changes in response to every reviewer comment, but you do need to somehow acknowledge every reviewer comment. And sometimes the way I acknowledge it is just to say, we considered this, but it doesn't make sense because of this, this, and this. Or I'll say, this comment seems to contradict what reviewer 2 is saying, so we took this approach to it. So I don't always directly address every comment. I try to address as many as I can, because you don't want to just ignore reviewer comments. So I would say I probably address 90 to 95% of reviewer comments, but there are sometimes comments, that you just can't address. Sometimes I've just had to say, that's really interesting, but we don't have the data to address that. And then I literally can't address it. Or I'll just say, this seems contradictory, or I'll just, do something a little bit different to address it. So I think you need to really think about that. When you revise and submit, at least in my field, you have to write a response to the reviewers and to the editor. So when I do the response, what I usually do is I make a table, a 2-column table, and I put all the reviewer comments in the left side of the table, and then in the right side of the table, I tell them specifically how I addressed it. So I'll say, on page 5, I did this, this, and this. Or if a comment threads throughout the whole paper, I'll say, in these sections of the paper, we rethought this piece of it. So I try to be very point by point specific about how I address the reviewer comment. So there's no doubt about what I did. Or if I didn't address the comment, I explain that in the table as well. And the last thing I'll say before I turn it back is, in my entire career, I have never had a paper that didn't get published somewhere. And sometimes it was not in the journal I originally submitted to. Sometimes it's like after 3 submissions to different journals, but you really do need to be persistent. And because if you've done some good work, there is a place for it. It's, sometimes it's in a lower tier journal, and sometimes it's in a journal with a different focus. But I've never actually had just an outright rejection that I've thrown a paper away. So I do think that you need to just kind of keep working it and figuring out where it fits, and what message you need, how you need to message it.
I hope I can say that someday. I've got a couple that I need to throw back into the.
And you have to throw them back in. You're not done with them yet.
Yeah. I think that's great. I think, my experience kind of varies, but it is true that some of the higher tier journals, what I find is they're a little bit more exacting too, in terms of the revisions that they want you to make. And sometimes just, their editorial staff just really goes over it with a fine-tooth comb. And sometimes you have to plan on that. You might end up spending a whole day or a weekend, fixing things based on editor comments, even when it was accepted, right? You still have to do some changes along the way. So that's something to think about. And the other thing is, if you get a rejection, maybe it's a desk rejection, or maybe it's a rejection after reviewers, and it's usually pretty clear what you're, if they ask you to resubmit or not. I've had a couple of times when it was a little bit unclear. I had one time when the vibe that I got from it was that, kind of resubmit if you want, but it didn't sound like that great a review. And then later the editor contacted me and said, we were wondering if you're going to resubmit that because we're really interested in it. And so, okay, I got working on that and sent it back to them. But so it's usually pretty clear though what the response is. And if it is rejected, don't be too disheartened, and don't think that you have to change everything based necessarily on the reviewers. You might find that, if you need to send it to a different journal that has a similar kind of scope and mission, that those comments will help you in revising it for that journal. But it may be that that's when you find out that you didn't fit the journal as well as you thought. And maybe there are some changes that or maybe it's more about finding the right fit for it. So those are the things that I would think about there. Just make sure, I think persistence is a big part of academia, really. Just keep at it.
Just a couple things that I'll add. One is, don't be afraid to communicate with the editors. You don't want to always communicate with the editors. I mean, you don't want to just keep bothering them, but at the same time, if you really have a question, you are allowed to communicate with the editors. So, do that if you need to. The other thing I would say though, if you get you made a good point about a rejection with reviews. I think you need to be careful. If you get a rejection with reviews, you should look at the reviews. And of course, you're not putting it back, sending it back to the same journal, so you don't have to address the reviews. But if there's, if the reviews are legitimate and there's ways to improve your paper, you should definitely do it. I'll just tell you a story. This actually happened in the last year. I reviewed a paper and rejected it and sent in my reviews. And then I got asked to review that same paper for a different journal. And they did not address any of my comments. And guess what I did? It got the same rejection with the same comments because I still had my review from the last time. So, you don't just think you're fast tracking the system or cheating the system because you're putting it to another journal. Like, use the reviews. Someone thought about those and was trying to help you. So, it would really be to your advantage to actually use them in a meaningful way.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And you never know when you're going to get reviewer 2 twice.
I have a question about addressing reviewer comments.
Uh-huh.
So how do you navigate a situation when you think the reviewer is practicing some unethical strategies? Like, for example, you submit a paper, it gets accepted into review, the reviewer's comments come back, minor and major things to fix. And then you see that one reviewer, their largest concern is that you need to include these 3 references as part of your paper. And then you go and you investigate these articles and you're like, all right, well, they don't really have much to do with what I'm talking about, but they, could fit. But then you realize that all 3 of these papers are written by the exact same author. Assumably, the reviewer is the author or someone that knows the author, or, it seems unethical that and unlikely that you would suggest 3 different articles that don't necessarily have much to do with the paper you're trying to publish, all written by the same author. So then you further be like, okay, I'll use one, and then maybe find other authors that have kind of written about the same topic and use those instead of all 3 by 1. And then they come back with the same comment that you need to use to get accepted by that reviewer, these 3 articles. How do you handle that kind of misconduct? Because in my personal opinion, that is unethical. And you're wielding power as a reviewer to kind of force this individual who's trying to publish to use your work to get more citations. So how do you navigate that as an author?
Yeah, a good editor should help mediate that situation, I think. But if I have had people suggest that I use citations that I don't think fit the work, and I've just, like I said, when I do the response to reviewers, I do an item by item response, and I just tell them that I don't think that these fit the work, and here's why. So justify it, I guess, is my point. Yeah, I don't know if they come back and say you have to. I mean, it's hard because you can't really cite people that don't fit the work. I mean, that's really difficult. I guess that's the case where I would communicate with the editor then.
Yeah, it made me think of an experience I had. I reviewed an article that was really relevant to something I had written, and recent enough that it probably should have been cited potentially. And I didn't say it directly to them, but there's a place in the reviews where you can mention something to the editors, and I mentioned it to the editors there as kind of a conflict of interest, but I just FYI. And I think that the editor actually asked them to include a citation to it later. So my point is, I would be a little surprised if it was somebody saying cite my 3 articles, but it's possible that somebody would do that. And I think that, I think Shari, your point is great. If it doesn't make sense to cite them, you can address that in your letter to the editor.
Yeah, and I don't think it would be as much the case if it doesn't fit, but I have actually when I review papers, like I feel like there was a case where the author was clearly unaware of another pretty significant author in the field where they were working. And I said, it seems like you haven't read so-and-so's work. Look at these articles. And it wasn't my work. I did give them a list of articles to read, but they weren't mine. I guess they could have interpreted that they were mine, but they were. And there's someone I've collaborated with, but they're also someone that has done really respectable work in the field that they should have been cited in the paper. So, I mean, hopefully someone's not just trying to promote their own work, which, I guess, I mean, it could happen. But
Yeah, that
but
was
if
kind
you
of my
really-
assumption was that it's more likely something like this is a colleague of someone, or they know this person and they think, oh, you should know this person's work. So they give you their 3 articles, but you
Yeah,
never
I
know.
mean, in this case, though, they really should have been citing this person. I mean, it was very closely connected. And, it was just clear that there was a gap in the literature that they were looking at. But if you really feel that it is wrong, and I would communicate with the editor, or at least justify in your response why you didn't do that. I have had that before, though, where someone said, oh, you need to cite so-and-so. And I read the paper and thought, no, I don't need to cite so-and-so. That doesn't even fit.
Any other questions?
I'll ask more questions if no one has one.
Oh, go ahead.
Kind of continuing on like what you were talking about with just your experience of like this individual, this author had a little bit of a gap in the knowledge of the papers that they were researching and then writing about. So you suggested one to them, which is really great as a reviewer. But how do you make sure, like as an author, especially as a young author, like how do you make sure that that doesn't happen to you? Like how do you make sure that you're doing the best that you possibly can to be up to date and make sure that you're including that up to date and recognizable research in your references?
That's a great question. This was something I'd skipped over, actually. One thing is, when you're doing the research on the journal that you're published in, you should look over recent issues of the journal to see if things have been published on your topic. And because that can be something that can be a red flag for the editors or the reviewers. If you're in the journal, you're wanting to publish something in this journal, but you clearly haven't been up on what they're doing. So that's one way to start. I would also talk to your advisor and, get other people to let you know if there are things that you're missing.
Yeah, and one thing that I do to make sure that I'm being pretty thorough is I actually look at the citations in the papers that I am citing. Because sometimes, if they're citing a whole bunch of one person and I'm not reading that person, that always tips me off, like, wow, I might be missing something here. And the other thing is sometimes I read, and this happens a lot, I think, with like grad students who are writing dissertations, and they do a lit review and they start their dissertation. And then by the time they get done, it's like 2 years later. And there's like more work that's come out. Make sure that before you submit that you're looking, at what's newer out there. If there's no citations in the last few years, that always makes me think that people haven't looked at looked at the most recent work that's out there. So, do another search, especially if you've been writing the paper for a long time. Do another search and just, search on some keywords and make sure that you're hitting the newer stuff out there. At least in my field, conference proceedings are sometimes a good place to look too, because the most recent work is coming out in those proceedings. And I can say, oh yeah, so-and-so is working in this field. And then I can go search, if they've published any papers recently.
Yeah, the other thing is I do Google Scholar alerts for keywords that are kind of in some of my niche areas of research. And so I get alerts and that helps me to kind of keep up on that topic. Sometimes it'll be in journals that I hadn't thought of where they're using that term, so that can be kind of helpful.
Yeah. Or you can do journal alerts too on journals that are sort of the mainstream ones that you would publish in. They'll send you like a table of contents when a new issue comes out. And sometimes I just scan those, and sometimes I scan them and say, oh yeah, nothing there that's really relevant to my field. And sometimes I think, wow, I've got to read that, and that. So, it's a quick way to keep on top without doing a search. It just comes up in my email. I can scan it quick and see, stay on top of what I should be paying attention to. It's a continuous problem, not only when you're new. It's staying on top of everything. There's a lot of information out there now. Any other questions or comments? If not, I think
So you're ready to
Mayor's still
publish
here.
now.
You're ready to publish, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, for answering all my questions.
Thank you for asking your questions.
Yeah,
They're
thank you.
great.
Well, I'm trying to publish and I'm getting closer to my end date. So I'm just trying to get as much advice as I possibly can. So I really appreciate both of your insights and professionalism.
Well, thank you. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
I think Umair said that he was going to have to step out potentially.
he
Didn't
is.
he have?
I think he is. So I
another
guess
meeting or
maybe we
something?
can just end the meeting.
Yeah.
All right.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Take care.
You too.